Our next speaker in this series is Dr. Emily Missyabit Macaulay. She's a member of the Lake Manitoba First Nation. She received her master's in biology from Carleton University in 2009 and a PhD in biological sciences from Simon Fraser University in 2020. Her research interests include food web interactions, species distribution modeling, geomatics, stable isotopes, citizen science, and Indigenous knowledge systems. Emily is the director of the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Indigenous Science Liaison Office, as well as the AAFC-hosted Interdepartmental Indigenous Science Technology Engineering Mathematics Cluster. The iSTEM cluster brings together 13 federal departments and agencies to inform and enhance federal policies, programs, and activities related to STEM disciplines in order to increase and expand support for Indigenous priorities in environmental stewardship, research, and technology development and transfer. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you, Kitchi McWetch. Thank you for the warm welcome. It's always funny I never know if you're going to read out the entire biography, and it's always funny to hear about my work coming from someone else. So, no, thanks so much for that. I'll try to get the presentation up on the screen here while I'm talking. As you can probably tell from my biography, I'm a bit of a jack of all trades and certainly not an agricultural scientist. So the majority of my work relates to supporting and enabling federal researchers to engage in relationship building, engagement and co-development of research projects with Indigenous partners. So that's kind of the work I'm going to be talking about today, but I thought that previous talk set us up really well because there's quite a bit of opportunities within the Canadian agricultural sector to sort of engage in once we've kind of gone through that relationship building and that rebuilding of trust with Indigenous partners, to really begin to start bridging, braiding and weaving knowledge systems and contributing, tools and technologies and approaches and species from both Indigenous science and Western science in order to make the Canadian agricultural sector much more sustainable, and basing that on practices that have been developed here since time immemorial, with species that are adapted to our climate and practices that have been developed for this climate. So really happy to talk about some of that enabling work today, but gonna have to turn to some of my colleagues on the call, or just give some general examples of some projects that we've enabled through our work, because I'm more of the approaches to partnership person. So with all of that said, and hoping that you're seeing the presentation and not my terrible inbox right now, I think I've already gone over, kind of what I want to talk about a bit. So I might just skip over this slide. But as was kind of already mentioned, there is an Indigenous Science Liaison Office within the Science and Technology branch at Agriculture Agri-Food Canada. That office was created in 2020 officially, but there has been a science liaison function with Indigenous partners in the branch since 2016. So we have been undertaking a lot of pilot projects and a lot of training for researchers and supporting researchers from that cultural perspective in terms of kind of translating Indigenous science into Western terminology, and also vice versa, translating Western science into Indigenous terminology to enable those research partnerships. We have been doing that for a little bit. And recently, which I will also talk about, we've been taking a bit more of a systematic approach to that, which I'll just talk about in a couple of slides. And then, of course, as was already mentioned by our host, we are also, the department is host to the Interdepartmental iSTEM cluster, where we're really doing everything that we can to mobilize our existing federal resources to support Indigenous aspirations in STEM, including in agricultural research. And the reason for that is that, and the opportunity is really that Indigenous science and natural sciences have a really common and inherent connection to the land and the knowledge that we gain from the land. And so there's quite a bit of opportunity for collaboration, which I'll talk about a little bit today. I'm not going to go through this slide in too much detail. This is really just to really underscore what I just said, which is that we have been undertaking this work for quite some time now. I find that a lot of the time when we talk about that the work that we're doing, people are kind of, they get a little bit overwhelmed and they say, you know, why are you trying to do so much at once? And I say, actually, you know, we've been sort of increasing the amount of work and the scope of that work for a number of years now, and that's how we've gotten to where we are. So as an example, you know, really started with some of the fundamental capacity building exercises within our organization to even understand Indigenous issues. And so that started in 2016 with the launch of our Indigenous Student Recruitment Initiative, which is still running strong. And we have hired, I think, close to 200 Indigenous students through that initiative over the years, and also brought a number of them in as permanent employees, over 30 of them, either within our department or in other departments upon graduation. So that is a really great way that I think we're enhancing organically our capacity in our organization to even develop Indigenous policy and programs and undertake this type of collaborative work. Just to highlight just a few things on this slide, not everything, but in 2018, our branch did make it a priority for our research scientists to propose work that would advance our understanding of Indigenous agriculture in its many forms, whether traditional, whether contemporary, you know, sort of commercial scale, or a combination. And that priority has remained in our annual call for proposals since that time. And so we've had a number of research projects, I think over 7, through that annual call for proposals that are co-developed or in partnership with Indigenous partners. And I'm also going to talk about later on in this presentation a smaller fund that we felt a need to establish to enable some of this work as well. And then just to highlight as well that we are working with our Office of Intellectual Property and Commercialization. There's a lot of need to protect Indigenous knowledge when you're working in these types of partnerships. Certainly, there is always a potential for Indigenous knowledge to be misappropriated, and for others to sort of gain the benefits of that Indigenous knowledge, which has been maintained and protected for tens of thousands of years, and in some cases really intentionally disrupt it. Sometimes, you know, there is a tendency, and there's a history of Western science extracting that Indigenous knowledge and benefiting from it, but not returning any benefits to the community that it came from. So working with our Office of Intellectual Property and Commercialization to ensure that we're protecting Indigenous knowledge and data with all of the tools we have available to us now, and also developing new tools through the ISTEM cluster. And so one of the sort of more systematic approaches that we're now taking to supporting Indigenous research partnerships over the last couple of years, our Science and Technology branch has been developing a strategy for our entire branch in terms of supporting Indigenous agriculture. And it's based on 3 key objectives. And the first and primary one is to build trust and relationships. There's really no potential to co-develop a research project without trust, and without taking the time to build those relationships first. And I'll talk about a fund that we created to enable that relationship building, because we saw that as a need, and we didn't have any tools at our disposal to be able to engage in relationship building within our current funding mechanisms. In those annual call for proposals, those projects are typically about 3 years long, and we find it takes at least a year to build that relationship and co-develop a project, and sort of, you know, at that point you only have 2 years left for field work or lab work, and so it was just that was not a functional model for us. Our other 2 key objectives from this strategy are to ensure that the research that we're doing and the development of technologies, and then especially that tech transfer, is really aligned with Indigenous priorities, which tend to be a little bit more holistic and broad in scope than our traditional science projects. They tend to be more aligned with food systems as a whole, and not just sort of agriculture the way that our department tends to define it. And then our third objective is really to increase Indigenous capacity to either take part in these partnerships, or even to lead their own research. So for example, a lot of emphasis is put on transferring technical skills to Indigenous partners throughout the duration of these research projects, so that if we end up in a situation which is common to occur, in that our funding cycles, those projects tend to run out of funding, and sometimes there is a gap year in funding. The Indigenous partner can carry on the research, even if we're not able to continue participating on our side. So a lot of work went into this strategy. It was, kind of co-developed with within our department and with our Indigenous employees within the department, but also with our existing partners. And it is an evergreen strategy. We are going to continue to co-develop as we continue building these relationships. But really, it's out there as a model for other departments or organizations to take a look at. So happy to answer questions on that. It is very, very, very outcomes based, as you'll see. And just a couple of things I'll highlight on this slide. It is distinctions based. So we recognize that not only are there First Nations, Métis Nation, and Inuit in Canada, but there are also a broad diversity within those groups, and certainly a diversity of relationships and histories of interaction with the federal government. So really no one size fits all approach to this, and we're really taking a learning by doing approach. Every time we get a new project, we really tailor our advice, and really we in the Indigenous Science Liaison Office really need to have that relationship with the research scientist as well, to even understand what the project is, so that we can then offer our best advice in terms of making that project effective and respectful and successful. And then that knowledge then does feed back into our branch strategy as well. Another sort of principle I wanted to point out is this mainstreaming versus, we often get the question, do you need a deliberate, distinct Indigenous approach, whether it comes to funding or research co-development, or do you kind of want to mainstream that across all of your, all of your commodities, all of your research streams? The answer is always both. Indigenous peoples have really been excluded from the Western science system in the way that the federal government, sort of identifies its research priorities. And so for that reason, there is a deliberate approach that is needed to make sure that we're deliberately reaching out and seeking Indigenous perspectives, and then amplifying those perspectives within the department. However, we also, it's necessary to also mainstream that across all the work that you're doing. And that was part of the impetus for creating this strategy, was for us to communicate to the branch at large, and to all of our staff in the science and technology branch, why it is important to support Indigenous participation in agriculture, what we're already doing within the department and the branch, and how they can contribute. So just wanted to point out that dedicated versus mainstreaming. And then again, as I already mentioned, ensuring that we're transferring direct benefits to Indigenous partners throughout the life of these projects, whether that is transfer of skills, often it's also student hiring opportunities, and it can even be service contracts as well, offers employment and some economic benefits to our partners. Just going to make sure I'm not going to go over time here. So we did identify, as I said, a need for a funding mechanism to support relationship building. We have developed in the last couple of years, and we launched, a relatively small fund, internal funding available throughout the year for all of our research scientists to apply to when they encounter opportunities to build a relationship that could lead to a research partnership with a potential Indigenous partner. I won't spend too much time on the details, but happy to revisit during the discussion. But really, just want to also highlight that it's really difficult to sort of measure the performance and success of these projects using a kind of more standard, typical Western scientific outputs like number of peer-reviewed articles. And so really what we are looking for in these projects is to see them move along that continuum of co-development over the years, from that sort of more researcher-driven priorities, AAFC-driven priorities, to being more Indigenous-led or co-developed, and really happy to talk about that in a bit more detail as well. And so we have funded quite a few relationship building activities over the past 2 years as well. Unfortunately, this fund has really only been active under COVID. So a lot of these activities have unfortunately had to be sort of postponed until it is safe and suitable for us to be engaging in person with our Indigenous partners. But a lot of different, like a pretty wide range of interests and potential projects from our partners. You'll see here, there's interest in sort of looking at soil amendments. Certainly always a lot of interest in community gardens, and not always for the purposes of food production necessarily. Oftentimes that's more in the interest of just getting youth and elders engaged, and sort of demonstrating that it's possible, but not so much to feed the community. Certainly a lot of interest in geomatics. This is one that does cross over into my research expertise. And I think, geomatics is a huge opportunity for Indigenous agriculture and Indigenous communities in general to sort of be taking control of the decisions that are made on their lands. And a lot of traditional agriculture. And just want to point out that traditional doesn't necessarily mean old-fashioned. Indigenous technologies and approaches continue to evolve. And so when we talk about traditional, that is something that, I guess as an example, a lot of the time we hear things like, well, traditional hunting doesn't really occur anymore because people are using snowmobiles and guns now, but they are still using sort of their traditional hunting grounds and methodologies in combination with sort of more modern technologies, which is exactly the kind of thing we expect to enable within Agriculture Canada, as well as these interdisciplinary projects where we take, for example, lessons learned from the Three Sisters, companion planting, Haudenosaunee methodology, combine that with some of the technologies and approaches within our branch to really co-create new knowledge and new approaches that are hopefully much more sustainable than some of the current approaches that we're taking. And then just an overview of where our research projects are taking place. And these gray dots are the relationship building ones. And you can see that where the relationship building activities are occurring, some are starting to lead into longer term projects, which is really great. I think I'll leave it at there for now because I think I'm out of time, but happy to revisit in the discussion. Miigwech, thank you.